springs of the seas, and I walk in search of the very depth of the seas. And so our title tonight is, Where Were You When the Sea Brake Forth? When the sea brake forth. And so the Lord here is he's talking about his magnificence. He's saying, I've got all the power. I hold everything together. I've got all the wisdom to design everything in this world. And so what I've done in your life is wise. And what you need in your life, I have the power for. I am able. God is showcasing the splendor and grandeur of his ability and his strength and his care for providing for his creation. And in this passage here, he's using the seas and the oceans and the water to glorify himself and to show off who he is and what he is. It's not just geology that speaks to him. It's marine biology that speaks to him. It's oceanography that speaks to him, and all of the various subdivisions that are encompassed in those studies. And so I'll give you just a few items here to jot down if you're in the habit of keeping the outline. Number one, he controls the waters. He controls the waters. Verse 8, who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? So God compares the breaking forth of seas to a child being born, to a child breaking forth. He's talking about his creation and when he created the seas. And so that brings us back to Genesis chapter 1. And we understand when we look at Genesis chapter 1 that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The deep what? The deep waters. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. God's initial creation of the universe and this planet was water. When our planet was first created, there was no land yet. There were no rocks yet. It was without form. It was shapeless, and there was a voidness to it, but there was water. What God made initially was water. It was a watery planet, and God moved upon the face of those waters. The Spirit of God moved upon the deep waters. That was the initial creation. Then we come to day 2. And on day 1, of course, he creates light in the days and the light in the dark, and the evening and morning were the first day. On day 2, God divided the waters from the waters. Hold on, what does that mean? From a oceanographic or marine biological standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, what does that mean that God divided the waters from the waters? Well, God separated the water that he had created into 2 distinct groups. One of those distinct groups is the water that would form the seas, the water that would make up the oceans, and the water that would be subterranean water that would be in the fountains of the great deep. The other group was the air, the atmosphere, atmospheric waters, the moisture content in the air. And so when God divided the waters from the waters, he was sending waters to the sea, designating a portion of the water that he created. You're going to be seas. This passage says he decreed it. And that was the bursting forth, the breaking forth that he compares to a child being born. God designating and delineating his creation from the day before as a certain kind of water that's going to occupy a certain place in all the things that we see. And then we get to day 3. And by the way, he calls that the gathering together of the seas. So it's the waters divided from the waters, specializing what its performance and its purpose. And then on day 3, that's when dry land is formed. And that's when he forms the dry land appears, and he calls it earth. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 9 is when he calls it earth. And so that is the bars and doors here. Job 38, look at verse 10. Yeah, in verse 8, there's doors. He shut up the sea with doors. In verse 10, and break up for it my decreed place and set bars and doors. What do bars and doors speak of? Bars and doors speak of barriers or endpoints where it can come no further. And it follows that when God formed the dry land became a barrier where the ocean could go no further. The water could go no further. God said, I'll put water where I want to put water. I'll put land where I want to put land. And I'll make sure the water doesn't get on the land where I don't want it to. Bars and doors. He in his power, keeps it where he wants it and set those things in place. He permits them to go where they want to go, where he wants them to go. Proverbs 8, 27 through 29. In Proverbs 8, it is wisdom speaking, and it's the wisdom of God speaking, and wisdom existed before matter did. Water is matter, and so this is wisdom speaking, and this is what is said here in Proverbs 8, 27. When he, speaking of God, this is wisdom speaking of God. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he gave to the sea his decree, just like it says here, that the waters should not pass his commandment, I was there. Wisdom predates matter, wisdom predates water, and the wisdom of God was present as God commanded where the water would stop, where its bars and doors would be, where it would be permitted no further. And then, of course, on day 5, God makes great whales and all the living creatures that would be brought forth by the waters, that would be brought forth abundantly after their kind. God then, on day 5, filled the waters with living things. He made all of them. He made everything in the sea. He made them all. And God is in complete control of every molecule. I'm not sure which is smaller, the atom or the molecule. One of them's smaller. I know water is H2O, and you could break down the diagram of the parts, and they're very small, and God controls every single molecule. I saw a visual representation recently of how deep the ocean really is. And like, we don't even really comprehend how deep it is. Like, I saw some graphics that showed, well, a person is this big, and a whale is this big, and about down here is where the farthest place our submarines have ever gone. And then you got to basically keep going all the way down here just to show any kind of representation of the true depth of it. And God is aware of every bit of it, controls every bit of it. And he shows that in his word. Let me give you just a few examples briefly. Only 6 chapters later, we've got a flood. God controlling waters. God controlling every single molecule of water. And then a little while later, we've got a Red Sea crossing where God shows I can make water stand up if I want to. And then a little while after the Red Sea crossing, we've got bitter water and people dying of thirst. And God says, I can use a tree to make that water sweet. I control the water. So you can drink and you can live because I want you to live. And then we've got a Jordan River crossing where the waters of the Jordan River do almost the same thing that the waters of the Red Sea did so that God could get his people through. We find Jonah on a boat, and we find God in control of those waters, and God sending storms to those waters, and God controlling every organism and every animal and preparing. God prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. The fish did exactly what God wanted it to do because God controls everything in the seas. We find God the Son rebuking storms and them calming. He literally could calm a storm. What manner of man is this? That even the wind and sea obey him. His verbal commands affected the matter of the water. And then he walked on water, controlling, showing his control over the water. He could control a fish with a coin in its mouth so that his taxes could be paid. Wow. Revelation chapter 5, we're told that every creature on the earth, under the earth, and even in the seas, as John writes Revelation 5, he says, I heard every living thing in the seas say to praise the Lamb on the throne for his wisdom and power and glory and honor. God gets praise from everything in the seas, everything that's in there. Revelation 20:13, even the sea gave up their dead. When God puts all bodies back together, praise God that ours is at the rapture, and we're only going to the judgment seat of Christ and not to the white throne. But He'll bring bodies back as well to the white throne, and the seas will give up their dead. Every lost man that's been buried at sea, that God knows He's in control of every molecule. He knows where that body is. He's going to be in control of every physical body. They're all going to get put back together, and they'll all receive their judgment. Those either to the resurrection of life or to the resurrection of damnation. So He controls the waters. But then number 2, He enters the springs. He enters the springs. Look at verse 16. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? He's saying, I have. I have entered into the springs of the sea. Job says, yeah, I haven't done that. Well, what are these springs of the sea? The sea has springs in it? Yeah, the sea has rivers in it. The sea has currents in it. The sea has paths in it. The sea has streams in it. And that's what's being spoken of here. Psalm 8:8, the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the seas. They're like rivers within the sea. For example, the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream begins in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of Florida, on the western side of Florida, and it flows around the peninsula. It flows all the way up the Atlantic coast, and then it crosses the Atlantic Ocean by Great Britain. It carries 5,000 times more water than the Mississippi River does, and it provides warmth. In fact, many have suggested that Great Britain's winters would be unbearably frigid without the warmth of the Gulf Sea, perhaps even uninhabitable at wintertime, because God takes care of his people. He puts springs into the sea, paths into the sea. If these rivers in the sea did not exist, one creationist scientist says that, okay, well, if they didn't exist, what would the seas be like? What would happen? What would the effect of that be? If there were not springs of water in the seas, the whole ocean would be filled with death and decay. The beginning from the bottom, the stagnant water would gradually produce noxious fumes that would kill all of the bottom dwelling creatures at the bottom of the sea. And that stench and the death and the black waters would slowly be heated by the earth's own internal body heat, and it would boil over to the temperature even of the hotter places of the water, and then the whole oceans and seas would begin to turn over itself, venting it up to the top, pushing off fumes and poison into the whole atmosphere, and flora and fauna couldn't survive, and everything would be ruined. And so the streams, the paths of the seas have this cleansing, refreshing effect where they're life-giving. They bring vibrancy to the sea. They allow for life at the very bottom of the sea. Rather than it becoming unstable and turning over, it allows for life. And so that's been in there since David wrote Psalm 8:8. Been there a long time. You know when man figured it out? A couple hundred years ago. Matthew Morey discovered. He's one of the founders of one of the fathers or founders of oceanography. He was reading Psalm 8 one day, and he said, "There's paths in the sea." He had a naval background, and so he confirmed and began to chart. This is in the 1800s. Matthew Morey began the process of oceanography, charting and finding out where they are and tracking them. And who'd have thought man benefited greatly thereby, because God put them in there for man's benefit. They didn't happen by accident. It was because God is good. It's because God made this earth for us to live on it. It was because God knew what would help us. And so that information greatly improved a lot of things for man. Early seagoing vessels that didn't have the advantages of today's mechanized modern technology, when they got a hold of this stream can push. And so shipping becomes much more efficient if you use that stream to your advantage. The warmth of that stream, the speed of that stream, you get goods and people across the globe a lot faster, a lot more fuel efficient. God set those paths in motion for our benefit. And he tells Job, I have entered into them. Have you entered into them? And Job says, no, I haven't. The Gulf Stream, Florida there, and no, I haven't been there. And there's more of them. That's not the only one. There's probably some currents and gulfs and streams that we don't even know about. But God has been in all of them. Psalm 139 talks about his omnipresence. He's been in each and every one of them. Psalm 77:19, thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. God's footsteps, where he's entered, that's not even known, where our God has been. So he controls the waters. Number two, he enters the springs. And that's where I want to spend most of our time. Number three, he searches the depths. He searches the depths. That's in verse 16. Job 38:16. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? I have. Or hast thou walked in the search of the depth? It says, Job, are you aware of the deepest places of the seas, the depths? Have you personally been there and seen them? I have. The depths, the bottoms. Job, do you know what's at the very bottom of the oceans? I do. There is not a single animal, there is not a single plant, there is not a single mineral that God is not aware of, that God doesn't care about, that God doesn't care for. His power is that great. Every day, every moment, he sustains every molecule of water. He's acutely aware of every tiny little microscopic plant at the bottom and inside every ocean in this universe and on this planet. Job, can you search it? Because I can search it. I know what's there. He knows what's at the depths of the seas. The bottoms of the seas testify to their creator. And let me just kind of go through, I think, some examples that will, I think, increase our faith with regard to what's in the oceans. The first one is and so really what we're doing in a lot of these is showing how foolish evolution is. If evolution were true, you would have, remember, evolution says that organisms began as very simple, and they lived and died, and then they slowly progressed and got more complex, and those lived and died, and they kept living and dying for billions of years. And so if evolution were true, the bottom of the sea would be littered with a tremendous amount of marine animal fossils, because you would have billions of years of living, dying, progressing, evolving, living, dying. The marine floor, the ocean floor would be utterly littered with the fossils of marine creatures. It's not. There is a stark absence of fossils of marine creatures on the ocean floors. They're not there. So evolutionists don't know what to do with that. Well, where are they? Almost all of the marine animal fossils that have been discovered are in rock layers. The fossils of sea creatures are found on the continents. They are found at the top of the highest mountains in the world, including the Himalayas. Sea-dwelling creatures, they're fossils. Why? How did that happen? Because there was a worldwide flood, because the tops of the highest mountains were covered in water. Part of the flood was underwater tsunamis that were breaking off giant pieces of rock and land and throwing fossils in every which direction and left and right and pulling them from where they were and launching them into other places. That's exactly what the fossil record shows. The fossil record shows the fossils of sea creatures mixed right in with the fossils of land animals, because the underwater tsunamis threw them all, it was scattershot. And so they're found right next door, right nearby each other. And then there's the matter of erosion. We talked about erosion a little bit last week with regard to geology, but it is relevant to the seas as well, in that erosion takes place and wind and water break off parts of earth, break off dirt and rocks, and much of it goes into the seas, especially on cliff faces that are next door to a body of water. When erosion breaks off pieces of rock, they fall into the sea. Well, so if evolution is true, and if that's been going on for billions of years and millions of years, and if evolutionists are right that uniformitarianism says that the rates have always been the same and have never changed, and if evolution is right that there was never a worldwide biblical catastrophic event, well, then we should find a ginormous pile of rocks at the bottom of the seas. But we don't. The pile of rocks at the bottom of the seas is very small. If evolution were true, it would be hundreds and hundreds of times thicker and larger and wider than it really is, because the earth isn't that old, and because there was a catastrophic event, and that's what accounts for the evidence that we see. And then there's the octopus. So we're going to get into some creatures here that are in that sea, and this message could be 5 hours long with these, so I had to whittle down a little bit. We'll see a couple videos here. But what creatures are found down there? Well, we'll begin with one of the more lower dwelling creatures, and that is the octopus. And I'll show you a video in a moment, but you learned about the octopus in school. The octopus is soft. It doesn't have a bony skeleton. And so that means that decomposition of an octopus is very fast. You know, if your body dies and somebody kills you, nobody finds you. I'm sorry to give you such morbid thoughts, but the human body, what takes longest to decompose? The bones do. You know, there's a skeleton that may be there a while later, but the rest of it decomposes quickly. Well, if you don't have a bony skeleton, you decompose very fast. And so when an octopus dies, it decomposes very quickly because bacteria and scavengers eat away at the muscle, and it's just a blob, and it's gone within days because there's no bone that lasts. And so you'd think that if that had been happening for billions of years, that we wouldn't find any skeletons or pardon me, any fossils of octopi at all, because they would all disappear so quickly. But yet we do. We do find fossils of octopi with muscles intact, with ink intact, with gills intact. Well, hold on. I thought scavengers and bacteria eat away at that stuff very quickly. They do. So what conditions do you have to have in order for an octopus to be fossilized that quickly? Buried in rock layers quickly, die quickly, and be so thoroughly covered in sediment that there's no opportunity for oxygen to get in to support the life of bacteria or predators. You know, like a worldwide flood, where it's deposited into rock layers instantaneously and laid down in rock layers because God is moving the plates of the earth, and ocean deposits are covering it in rock layers instantaneously so that no bacteria or scavengers can get in. And within the fossil, there's ink and there's gills and there's muscle remaining. It's an amazing thing. Before we show the video here, let me touch on this. Biology textbooks that espouse evolution and try to indoctrinate our community's children in the bogus philosophy and theory of evolution, they're very strategic about what examples they highlight and emphasize and point out, and which examples they conveniently omit. And they love to talk about the similarities between the structures of human anatomy and animal anatomy where it suits them. So they'll say, well, look at the human arms and legs, look at the human limbs, and look at the similarities in the design. They don't use the word design, but in the structure of the human limbs with bird limbs. A bat's, you know, their little arms and the wing comes out. They look at the arm, their little legs, the bird legs. They say, boy, there's a lot of similarities. And so they say similarities can only come from the same genes. Well, scientifically, that's not true. Similar structures can come from different genes. And that's exactly what has occurred. They're similar because they have the same designer. They have the same maker. And our maker is able to use some of the same methods to make different creatures different. There's some similarities and there's some differences. But evolutionists use that argument when it suits them and not when it doesn't. And the octopus, there are far more similarities between the eyeball of a human being and the eyeball of an octopus than there are similarities between the arm or leg of a human and the arm or leg of a bird or bat. It's not even close. But they never talk about those because nobody argues that the human and the octopus have a close ancestral relationship. So it's not a convenient argument for them to make. And that's their willingness to ignore some of the evidence and promote other evidence. It exposes the weakness and the fraudulence of their argument, that they strategically select which things they'll bury and not talk about and which things that they'll make widely known. Now, there is an octopus that was discovered only 20 years ago called the Mimic Octopus. And that's what this video shows. I'll get both of these lights here. It's like a minute and a half.
First by fishermen off the coast of Indonesia in the 1990s. It looked like an octopus, but it could morph its shape in an instant to appear as seemingly any animal around it. At first, no one had any idea what it was.
The first time I saw it, I just was blown away. You couldn't get a more spectacular animal. It really is the pinnacle of wizardry.
Biologist Mark Norman was the first scientist to study this seemingly shapeless creature. He named it the Mimic Octopus.
The mimic octopus makes itself look like a living, moving animal. So it pulls all its arms around behind its body and swims along like a poisonous flatfish called a banded sole. In other cases, if it's getting attacked, it puts 6 arms down a hole and raises the other 2 arms to look like a poisonous sea snake that has bands along its body. If that's not enough, it'll swim along looking like a poisonous lionfish with these banded arms looking like the banded spines that come off these very deadly fish.
So far, 15 separate species are known to be in the Mimic Octopus Act, and Norman is not always sure exactly what the mimic is doing. He observed this mimic scuttling along the sea bottom, looking something like a furry turkey with human legs.
Sometimes it's hard when you watch a mimic octopus doing what it does to interpret what's going on. It's a bit like looking at ink spots in a psychiatrist's office going, I don't know what that is. It could be a piano, it could be a fridge. So you get 3 or 4 divers together and you'll argue all night trying to work out what we think it was mimicking.
Where did nature's greatest actor come from?
So you can hit those lights and we'll do another video in a minute, but what an incredibly sophisticated animal. How did it do that? It has 6 layers of little balloon-like sacs filled with different pigmentation colors, and it uses them by expanding or contracting its muscles. But what brilliance God, the designer, has shown in this animal, that he has given that animal the ability to discern not just what is threatening it, but what will threaten what threatens it. It mimics something that its predator will be scared of. So it knows what's trying to get it, and it knows what will scare what's trying to get it. That is remarkable, and that kind of sophistication. We are trying to use that technology. When 20 years ago this was discovered, military researchers are in the process of emulating what that animal can do to develop camouflage. And we can get nowhere near the sophistication and complexity of this animal. And then there's the squid. The squid is similar to the octopus. God made a squid that can fly. It's a flying squid. I don't know if you've ever heard of the flying squid. It can leap 20 feet out of the water, and it can travel 180 feet in the air. And it's funny because fishermen are typically not regarded as very truthful individuals. You know, the old spinning a fisherman's yarn, and every fisherman that goes away at sea would come back and have these great tales of all the adventures that befell me upon the great seas. And I saw a squid that could fly 20 feet in the air, and nobody believed him. But in this case, they were right, because later on, videographers come along and actually capture it and document it. There's a squid that can fly. How did God do that? They shoot water out of their backside, which forms a jet stream that propels them into the air. And then when they're in the air, their front fins pull up and act like wings, and their back fins fold down to make the animal more aerodynamic, and it soars almost 200 feet in the air above the surface of the water. Well, why? Why did God make them do that? How does that help them? It's a lot more efficient. Using the same amount of energy, they can travel 3 times farther in the air than they can in the water. And so they are able to travel in a more efficient fashion. And we're told, so the evolutionists are asked, pray tell, how did this happen? Oh, well, it clearly evolved that ability over billions of years. Well, but the fossil record, here's what the fossil record shows. Squids that are regular squids, and those only, and it shows flying squids and those only. Missing completely is any other form. There's not just one transitional form missing, there's any transitional form whatsoever missing. There's regular squids and there's flying squids, and that's all there is. There is no in between. I mean, if evolution is true, it would take thousands of links, and there are 0 links. There's none. Evolution's not true, as you know. And then the orca. The orca, that's also known as a killer whale, and they're found in the depths of the seas. And what's amazing about the orca is that its hunting ability, it more resembles a sheepdog than it does a marine creature, a creature of the sea. And I want to show this one to you as well.
there are up to 1,000 of them. It's possibly the greatest gathering of orca on the planet. The herring may be plentiful, but in these winding fjords, they're not always easy to track down. These particular orca, however, are fish hunting specialists. They work as a team, coordinating their approach by calling loudly to one another. They herd the herring into tighter and tighter shoals. They swim below them, trapping them against the surface of the sea. And now the orca deploy their special weapon. They beat their tails with such force that the shock waves stun the herring. And then the senseless victims are easily collected. But all this underwater noise attracts others. Humpback whales. They move in on the action.
Gather together for Blue Planet 2.
Just go hunting for one little bite at a time, they'd never get full. And so they have to eat mass. Those little fish only don't provide much meat, and so they pool them all together, and then they can eat a whole bunch of them at once. And evolutionists have no explanation whatsoever for that level of coordination between them, that level of synchronization, that level of communication between them. They have no idea how they would have evolved that, because that kind of skill is only useful once it exists. How did the pre-hunting orcas survive? Well, if there were millions of years when they couldn't do that, how did they live? How did they eat? That's their survival method. And so they would have died out. They wouldn't have survived if they couldn't do that. Of course, we understand that when God first made them, there was no death. So God provided for them, and there were things they could eat that didn't involve prey until sin came. But God created them with that latent ability. And so all of the animals that became predatory animals had that ability in them at creation, and it came out at the time of the sin, when sin entered. And then the last one that I want to touch on is sharks. And sharks, they can swim so fast. Sharks cover so much area. And I would think that, all right, if they're going to be fast, they got to cut through the waters they must be smooth. I would think that, I get a haircut and I'm smoother and more aerodynamic. I should be a little bit faster, and race cars are real smooth. And so you'd think they'd be smooth. But you ever touch shark skin? It's not smooth. There's little holes in it. There's little dimples in a shark's skin. They're called denticles. They're little impressions. Why do they have that? Well, because those little holes, those little denticles create miniature whirlpools. And the combined effect of all those little whirlpools reduces resistance and reduces drag and allows it to maximize speed in the water. So God designed it for its speed in a way that we wouldn't even really guess is how that would work. One of the other benefits of those little denticles is that they prevent the growth of parasites. So it allows the shark to stay healthier for longer without parasites eating off of it. So how was that technology? Once man figured that out, which took a while, we thought, I wonder how we could use that. We may have some fans of golf in here. You know, the early days of golf balls were smooth. But they kept golfing and they kept finding that, you know, I've beaten this ball up pretty good. It's dented up and there's some little holes in it. This golf ball seems to travel a whole lot farther. You know, it's an awful lot like a shark skin. So why don't we make the golf ball with little dimples and little holes and little impressions? And that's, I asked Gary for one, that's how golf balls are made now. There's these little holes here, and that's how God made the skin of a shark, because each little hole produces a little whirlpool that aids in faster movement. It travels farther. It travels higher when it is struck. That technology that information that man has gotten from studying the shark has been used in a number of different ways. The company that won Invention of the Year 2008, Time Magazine Invention of the Year 2008, was a company that makes swimsuits. And they made a swimsuit that mimics the skin of a shark so that it could travel faster. You know who used those swimsuits? Michael Phelps, when he won 8 gold medals. And swimsuit gives its wearer such an advantage that they have since been banned from competition. That's how much faster you swim when you're wearing one of those bad boys. But where else is that technology being used? They're trying to use that same idea. Naval engineers are trying to incorporate that same concept into seagoing military vessels so that, again, they are more fuel efficient, so that they travel faster using less energy, cargo ships and the like. But then what about the parasites? Researchers are trying to use what we've learned from shark skin in hospital floors to reduce the growth of bacteria, to reduce the threats that come from parasitic growth anywhere. And so God's creation is for our benefit. Most of us have heard somewhere along the way that sharks can smell blood. Sharks can smell blood a long ways away. What I didn't know is that they have nerve receptors on their snout that allows them to pick up electricity. They don't just sense blood, they can sense electricity. They can sense the electricity given off by the beating heart of their prey. In fact, a shark can identify the location of a 9-volt battery 1,000 miles away. So a shark always knows the location of its next meal. It's getting that little jolt. It's getting that little electric jolt on its snout. Sharks also flourish in deep waters that are incredibly cold. How? The great white shark, it can swim so fast and it can perform so well in waters that are freezing cold. How does it flourish that way? How did God design it that way? God gave the shark a built-in counter-current heat exchanger. It's muscular activity causes warmth. You know, you do jumping jacks, you get warm. If it's cold out, you try to jump up and down a few times or run around, it may warm you up. So the shark's muscular system works in conjunction with its gills that pull oxygen out of water. They take in oxygen out of surrounding water, and its muscular system generates heat and exchanges it over to its circulatory system. So when the oxygen comes in, it's warmed up, and it's warm oxygen, warm blood is sent throughout the body of the shark. That is remarkable that God would suit that animal to survive exactly where he placed them, exactly where he wants them to swim and survive and flourish. He equipped them for exactly what they need to be in that part of the sea. Man finally figured out that kind of technology within the last century or so, when we figured out refrigeration and we figured out air conditioning finally. I mean, most of us probably didn't have air conditioning growing up. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, and that the system for it is very similar, a counter-current exchange system. And we only figured it out recently. God's been doing it for 6,000 years. He figured it out 6,000 years ago, and we didn't do it by accident. Nobody said 85 years ago, oops, my whole house is cold. I wonder how that happened. We intentionally worked at engineering and designing it that way. We made it that way on purpose. God made the shark that way on purpose. It wasn't by accident. The shark didn't do it himself. The universe didn't do it itself. God did it that way because even the depths of the seas, you search the depths. Like God told Job, have you searched the depths? I have. What do you find down there? You find creatures that praise and glorify the Lamb on his throne. All power, all glory, all honor, all majesty be unto the Lamb that is on the throne. Even the Orca says so. Even the shark says so. Even the flying squid says, Jesus is Lord. The Lamb is God. Wow. Man. And here's my favorite thing about it. The depths of the oceans, God said, that's where he put my sin. Our sin is as far removed from us that he's cast it into the depths of the sea. Into the depths of the sea. That's how far away God has taken my sin through Christ. He's my creator. He's also that shark's creator. And he's also that Mimic Octopus's creator. And he gives non-stop, non-ending examples of his lordship everywhere you look. They're all over. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. Look for them. Everything he's made testifies to him. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for what you've told Job. Lord, you were there when the seas break forth, when they issued as issuing out of a womb. You put the bars and doors there. And Lord, you cast our sin that far away through Christ. And